Imagine for a moment that you are walking down a quiet street in Berlin or Munich, expectant of the picture you've seen in magazines, on postcards, and in political speeches, the image of a prosperous, advanced European nation powered by wind turbines, solar panels, and high-tech ingenuity. You assume you are stepping into one of the most successful energy transitions in the world, a beacon of clean power, modern innovation, and a blueprint for how to save the planet and grow the economy at the same time. But what if I told you that beneath this fairy tale lies one of the most expensive, ambitious, and controversial national projects of the modern era, a project that cost Germany well over $500 billion, reshaped its economy, and ultimately changed the trajectory of its most important industries? What if the dream of green energy leadership morphed into a disaster that left factories struggling to stay competitive, households paying some of the highest electricity prices in the developed world, and political and economic reverberations that are still playing out today? This is not just another energy story. This is the story of Germany's green energy transition, the Energiewende, a political promise, an environmental crusade, and what some economists now call one of the most expensive national experiments in energy policy ever undertaken. If you think this narrative ends with Germany leading the world on climate change, you are missing most of the plot. In this deep dive from the calm capital historian, we are going to unpack how Germany spent roughly $500 billion on its green energy revolution, what went right, what went wrong, and why this chapter may have changed Germany forever. So buckle up, because this is not a comfortable story of progress. It is a complex, costly, and at times controversial tale of ambition running up against reality. To understand how Germany's green energy disaster unfolded, we first have to step back in time and examine the roots of what became known as the Energiewende, which literally means energy transition in German. At the turn of the millennium, Germany faced a choice about its energy future. Like many industrialized nations, it had relied on a mix of nuclear power, coal, and imported natural gas to keep its lights on and its factories humming. Nuclear energy provided a large share of emissions-free electricity, coal was a reliable and homegrown fossil fuel, and gas from Russia was relatively cheap. Over time, however, concerns about climate change, public opposition to nuclear power, and the pressure to align with environmental goals led policymakers to chart a bold new path. In 2000, Germany passed the Renewable Energy Sources Act, or EEG, designed to accelerate the deployment of wind, solar, biomass, and other clean technologies by guaranteeing above-market prices for renewable electricity fed into the grid. The law created strong incentives for investment, and in a relatively short time, Germany became a global leader in installing renewable infrastructure. Initially, advocates celebrated this policy as a historic push towards a greener, more sustainable energy system, one that would cut emissions, create jobs, and reduce dependence on fossil fuels. In theory, it was a win-win, transitioning the nation's energy system while nurturing a new clean tech industry. And for a time, it did unleash a boom in renewable capacity. But here is where the first flaw in the story emerges. The Renewable Energy Act's design meant that the government guaranteed high fixed prices for renewable electricity, known as feed-in tariffs, far above the market rate for conventional power. These premiums were paid for by levies on consumer electricity bills. Over time, these costs ballooned, hitting households and businesses alike with rising electricity prices. By some estimates, the total cost of this energy transition to consumers had amounted to well over $500 billion by 2025, and projections suggest it will only increase as the system expands. In political speeches, this cost was often downplayed or framed as an investment in the future. But for ordinary Germans looking at monthly energy bills or factory owners trying to keep production costs down, the impact was real and immediate. This brings us to the first deep irony in this story. Germany, the country that declared itself a global climate leader, ended up with some of the highest electricity prices in the developed world. Critics have repeatedly argued that while renewables were subsidized heavily and expanded rapidly, the transition strategy neglected other critical parts of the energy system, such as grid infrastructure and storage solutions that could manage intermittent wind and solar power. This leads us to the second major fault line in Germany's green revolution, the handling of traditional energy sources, especially nuclear power. For decades, Germany had operated a fleet of nuclear power plants that provided large amounts of reliable, carbon-free electricity. Nuclear power was controversial, but it was undeniably effective in delivering baseload energy without greenhouse gas emissions. In the aftermath of the 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan, Germany made a dramatic political decision to accelerate its nuclear phase-out plan and retire its reactors earlier than previously scheduled. These closures culminated in the shutdown of Germany's last nuclear plants in 2023, concluding a process known as the atomosting. Here's the tragic twist. Instead of allowing nuclear and renewables to coexist during the transition and provide a stable backbone for electricity supply, policymakers chose to retire nuclear first and push renewables in its place. That meant Germany removed a major source of carbon-free energy before it had fully built out a reliable, flexible alternative capable of meeting industrial demand without interruption. This decision had multiple consequences. 1. It left a gap in baseload generation that intermittent sources like wind and solar could not reliably fill on their own. Renewable output fluctuates with weather patterns and time of day, a phenomenon known as Dunkelflaut, when it is both dark and windless. Without nuclear, Germany had to rely more on fossil fuels like coal and natural gas to fill in the gaps, especially during peak demand or calm weather periods. 2. It forced Germany into a cycle of paradox where it was simultaneously trying to cut emissions while leaning more heavily on fossil generation when renewables could not deliver. In some years, coal and gas use rose just to compensate for the variability of wind and solar, raising questions about whether the transition was actually reducing emissions as aggressively as promised. And 3. The timing could not have been worse. In 2022, just as Germany completed plans to retire nuclear and scale back coal, Russia invaded Ukraine, prompting a geopolitical energy shock. Germany had already shut down its nuclear capacity, and it was rapidly reducing dependence on Russian gas. The combination of nuclear exit and Russian supply disruption sent gas prices into the stratosphere and left German industry scrambling for alternatives. The result was a perfect storm for energy costs. Households saw sharply higher electricity and heating bills, and energy-intensive industries faced structural cost increases that made German production less competitive compared to peers in the United States, China, and other regions where energy remained cheaper. Combined with weak economic growth and global headwinds, this contributed to what many analysts describe as a period of economic stagnation for Europe's largest economy. It was in this context that the idea of a massive €500 billion green investment fund emerged. In the mid-2010s, the German government agreed to create a special infrastructure and climate fund worth €500 billion to accelerate investments in renewable infrastructure, grid upgrades, and decarbonization projects. This fund was unprecedented in scale and marked one of the boldest fiscal gambles in Germany's post-war history, bypassing the nation's traditional debt brake rule on borrowing in order to inject capital into climate and energy projects. Supporters argued this massive fund was necessary to finally fix the bottlenecks, expand grid capacity, and finance technologies that would make renewable energy viable at scale. Detractors warned that borrowing so much to fund an already costly energy transition was risky and could burden future generations with debt and inefficiencies. But as the years passed, a striking pattern began to emerge, pointing to a broader truth about this experiment in green nation building. 1. Despite the billions spent, many of the underlying structural problems remained unresolved. Grid infrastructure continued to lag the pace of renewable deployment. Germany's north, where wind farms are abundant, still lacked the high-capacity transmission lines necessary to carry power to the industrial south. Bottlenecks in the network meant that at times renewable energy had to be curtailed simply because it could not reach where it was needed. 2. The reliance on intermittent energy without adequate storage solutions or backup generation continued to put pressure on reliability and cost. Without robust national storage systems, Germany had to export excess wind energy during windy periods and import power when conditions were calm or clouded, often at higher prices than domestic generation. The economic logic of this system created volatility in electricity markets and unpredictable price spikes for consumers and businesses alike. 3. The condition known as German grid paradox emerged, where more renewables and total installed capacity did not automatically lead to lower consumer prices, because the grid, the market design, and the backup requirements created inefficiencies that producers, grid operators, and consumers all had to shoulder. By mid-decade, critics began to argue that Germany's green transition was one of the most expensive collective energy policy experiments ever undertaken. Hundreds of billions of euros were poured into renewable subsidies, grid expansion plans, and new technology initiatives, yet the long-term results were ambiguous at best in terms of economic impact. Some studies predicted that the total lifetime costs of achieving the deep decarbonization goals could run into the trillions of euros when including grid, storage, transport, and industry electrification expenses, not just the initial $500 billion in subsidies and investments already spent. Now let's step back and look at how this $500 billion green energy effort impacted Germany's economy as a whole. For decades, Germany's economic success was built on a model of cheap, reliable energy powering world-leading manufacturing, automotive engineering, chemical production, and industrial exports. This model depended on stable energy costs, predictable supply, and global competitiveness in price and quality. When energy prices soared in the early 2020s due to geopolitical disruption and the structural effects of the Energiewende, that model came under strain. Manufacturers, especially those in metals, chemicals, and heavy industry, found their cost structures increasingly unattractive compared with competitors in countries with lower energy costs. Some companies publicly discussed relocating production to regions like the United States, Eastern Europe, or Asia, where electricity prices and energy reliability were more predictable. Elevated energy costs also fed into broader inflation and cost-of-living pressures for German households. While household electricity prices have dropped from the extreme peak seen during the immediate post-Ukraine invasion period, they remain high relative to neighboring EU countries, especially when taxes and levies are factored in. These high energy costs are sometimes cited as a factor in slowing consumer spending and dampening confidence among families and small businesses. At the same time, the German public and political consensus on energy policy began to fracture. For years, major parties of all stripes had supported the idea of an aggressive transition away from fossil fuels and nuclear energy. But as prices rose and industries felt squeezed, voices calling for a more pragmatic, diversified approach to energy, including keeping existing power plants online longer, expanding gas capacity, or even reconsidering nuclear power, grew louder. Some economists argue that Germany's approach was ultimately too rigid, too bound by ideology, and too slow to incorporate market realities and technological constraints. They point to countries like the United States and China, which pursued a broader energy strategy combining renewables with continued investment in advanced fossil fuel technologies, nuclear power, and grid modernization, ultimately producing cheaper and more reliable power for business and households. In contrast, Germany's all-in or replace fossil fuel strategy left it exposed to volatility, higher costs, and supply issues at a time when industrial competitors had diversified and strengthened their energy portfolios. Now let's tackle perhaps the most important question of all. Is Germany's green energy story a failure? The honest answer is complicated. On one level, Germany has undeniably driven an enormous expansion of renewables. Wind and solar energy capacity are among the highest in Europe, and the share of energy produced from renewables continues to rise. Plans to decarbonize the economy by the mid-21st century remain in place, and public support for climate action is still significant. But the deeper truth is that the path Germany chose, phasing out nuclear power while pushing renewables rapidly without fully solving grid, storage, and reliability challenges, and doing so in the midst of geopolitical energy disruption, has come at a cost that every household, business, and policymaker in Germany feels in the form of energy prices, industrial competitiveness, and economic uncertainty. In other words, Germany's energy transition may not be a failure in the narrow sense of not achieving cleaner energy. It is, however, a cautionary tale about the limits of ambitious policy without holistic system planning. It shows how political, economic, and technological decisions interact in powerful ways, and how even the best intentions can have unintended consequences when the real world tests theory. This is also why Germany's experience has become a reference point for countries around the world debating how to decarbonize without crippling their economies. So what does this mean for the rest of the world? First, It means that there is no one-size-fits-all energy transition. Each country has a unique energy mix, industrial base, political culture, and economic priorities. What works in Norway, with abundant hydro and sovereign wealth funds, may not work in Germany with its industrial complexity and anti-nuclear politics. What works in China, with centralized planning and cheap capital, may not work in decentralized democracies with powerful local opposition to infrastructure projects. Second, it means that replacing fossil fuels entirely before ensuring grid stability, competitive prices, and technological resilience can lead to economic stress, even if emissions targets are technically reached. Third, it means that holistic planning matters. Investing only in wind and solar without simultaneous investment in grid capacity, storage, backup power, and flexible market mechanisms is only half the battle. And finally, it means that energy policy cannot be separated from economic policy. If energy costs become so high that industries relocate, investments slow, or households cut back on spending, the broader economy can suffer. The lesson from Germany's $500 billion green energy experiment is that energy is not just an environmental issue, it is fundamentally an economic one. So in the end, is Germany's $500 billion green energy disaster a failure or a lesson? It is both. It is a testament to ambition, responsibility, and environmental leadership. It is also a warning about the cost of ideology outrunning infrastructure, the price of underestimating grid and storage challenges, and the fragility of a strategy built on replacing reliable base load power faster than the system could adapt. Germany's energy transition will continue to evolve, and future policy shifts may address many of the structural issues that have surfaced. The massive investments, the technological innovations, and the political will that drove the Energiewende will not simply fade away. But the legacy of this experiment, one that reshaped Germany's energy system forever, will serve as a pivotal chapter in the global story of how nations confront climate change, economic competitiveness, and technological transformation. This has been another deep dive from the Calm Capital Historian. If you found this analysis enlightening, thought-provoking, or valuable, share it with someone who wants to understand not just the promises of green energy, but the costs, complexities, and consequences that come with trying to reinvent an entire energy system at scale. Stay curious, stay calm, and until next time.